In the quiet suburban stretch of Virginia Beach, Pastor Timothy Omotoso arrived like a gust of warm wind, charismatic, eloquent, and undeniably captivating. His sermons at the newly established House of Eternal Grace Fellowship drew crowds far beyond what anyone expected for a church that had been, just months earlier, nothing more than a rented hall with folding chairs and a single borrowed keyboard. From the very beginning, he presented himself as a man sent by God, a spiritual healer, a mentor, and a guide whose connection to the divine seemed, at least to his followers, unquestionably authentic. His background story, which he crafted with chilling precision, only enhanced his mystique. He claimed he had studied theology intensively, traveled the world on mission trips, healed the sick, rescued victims of poverty, and brought souls to God in numbers too large to count. Many of these claims were unverifiable, but few in Virginia Beach were concerned with fact-checking the pastor who could make an entire room weep with a single prayer. His congregation saw him as a man sent to revive their faith. But over time, the facade began to fracture, revealing a darkness that had followed him from continent to continent, hidden beneath layers of charm, theatrics, and spiritual manipulation. Before arriving in the United States, Omotoso had spent years moving between various ministries. He made brief appearances in Durham and Atlanta, but he rarely stayed longer than 2 years. With each departure, there were rumors, or rather, patterns, allegations of impropriety, whispers of controlling relationships with young and unexplained financial losses within the churches he left behind. But he was always gone before investigations could gain traction, always leaving behind confusion, unanswered questions, and victims who blamed themselves long before they blamed him. In Virginia Beach, Omotoso saw fertile ground for his next chapter. Families seeking hope, teenagers seeking belonging, adults seeking forgiveness. Everything he needed to rebuild his power was waiting for him. He began by organizing youth purity workshops, framed as programs to protect young women from the dangers of secular life. To parents, the workshops sounded like blessings, structured, supervised, and rooted in Christian teaching. To the teenagers who attended, they seemed inspirational at first, but beneath the surface, they were carefully crafted funnels that brought vulnerable young women directly under his control. The first known victim was a 19-year-old choir singer named Emma Rodriguez, soft-spoken, dedicated, and admired for her voice. Emma found in the church a sense of home that felt warmer than anything she had ever known. Her mother worked long hours at a local hospital, and her father had passed away when she was 12. Pastor Omotoso noticed her immediately. After her first choir performance, he pulled her aside with what appeared to be gentle praise, telling her she had a spirit touched by heaven. He asked about her school performance, her emotional struggles, her hopes, and her fears. Emma, like many young adults, desperate for mentorship and belonging, opened her heart to him. He began to isolate her subtly, first through private vocal lessons, because your voice is a gift that must be shaped spiritually, not just musically. Then through mandatory one-on-one counseling sessions framed as spiritual cleansing. Emma's friends noticed her growing dependence on the pastor, but she dismissed their concerns. "He's just helping me," she said. "He understands me." What she didn't understand was the silent grooming process underway, designed with predatory precision. Meanwhile, financial irregularities began to surface. The church's treasurer, a mild-mannered accountant named Paul Jenkins, noticed discrepancies between donations and bank deposits. Thousands of dollars were missing. When he brought this to Omotoso's attention, the pastor responded with indignation, accusing Jenkins of lacking faith. He insisted that certain funds were designated for private spiritual missions. He alone understood. Weeks later, Jenkins quietly resigned from the board, unwilling to risk public conflict with a man the congregation worshipped not only as a pastor but as a spiritual father. The situation escalated when Pastor Omotoso introduced what he called divine apprenticeship, a program where select young women were handpicked to assist with ministry duties. Parents saw it as a prestigious honor, but for those chosen, the apprenticeship quickly became a cage. They were instructed to obey the pastor without question, text him constantly, and report their activities daily. He monitored their outfits, their social lives, and their relationships. He told them they were spiritually superior to their peers, chosen vessels of God, and that questioning him was equivalent to questioning divine authority. It was during this time that Emma, once lively and energetic, grew increasingly withdrawn. She lost weight, she cried frequently, she cut ties with her longtime boyfriend, Her mother noticed the changes but believed Emma's explanation, that she was simply overwhelmed with choir responsibilities. A facade encouraged by Omotoso himself, who assured congregants that intense spiritual work often led to emotional purification. Emma's breaking point came one night after choir rehearsal. She confided in a close friend, Sarah Nguyen, revealing a disturbing truth. Omotoso had coerced her during a private purity session, telling her that resisting him would mean resisting God. She felt trapped, confused, ashamed. Sarah, horrified, urged her to report him, but Emma was terrified of judgment, of losing her church community, and most of all, of the pastor who had convinced her that he held control over her spiritual fate. Sarah, unable to stay silent, went to the authorities. Her report reached the Virginia Beach Police Department, who launched a quiet preliminary inquiry. Detectives spoke with former congregants from Omotoso's previous ministries and began noticing unmistakable patterns. Young women abruptly leaving the church, sudden resignations by staff members, financial issues swept under the rug. The case, once faint, grew darker and heavier with each statement collected. The detectives moved carefully. They obtained a warrant to monitor church communications and collected testimonies from other teenagers in the Divine Apprenticeship program. Many hesitated to speak, terrified of spiritual consequences. But small cracks appeared, stories half told, private messages shared hesitantly, inconsistencies that investigators slowly pieced together. When detectives approached Emma directly, she broke down. She confessed everything: how she had been manipulated, coerced, and threatened with spiritual condemnation. Her statement became the cornerstone of the investigation. Authorities executed a search warrant on the church office. What they discovered destroyed any remnants of Omotoso's facade. Behind a locked cabinet were multiple phones and flash drives containing private videos of counseling sessions. Many featured vulnerable young women. Some were clearly filmed without their consent. Church financial records were also seized, revealing nearly $200,000 diverted into accounts connected to a shell company Omotoso had created years earlier. The arrest came swiftly. During a Sunday service rite, as he began preaching, detectives walked down the aisle and placed Pastor Timothy Omotoso in handcuffs. Congregants gasped, some cried, others shouted in his defense, believing their spiritual leader was being persecuted. The scene became a televised moment across WAVY-TV 10 by that evening. The trial took place at the Virginia Beach Circuit Court. Prosecutors presented a case built not only on Emma's testimony, but on months of investigative work. Former congregants from multiple states were flown in to testify. Several broke down on the stand as they described the psychological manipulation, the pressure to stay silent, the guilt used as a weapon against them, and the way Omotoso twisted scripture to justify his control. The defense attempted to frame the relationships as consensual and dismissed the financial discrepancies as administrative misunderstandings. They argued that the women were unstable, emotional, or confused, but the evidence was overwhelming. The secret recordings, the misappropriated funds, the testimonies of so many individuals who had never met one another yet described the same patterns. It all spoke to a predator who had perfected his craft behind the mask of pastoral care. After a 6-week trial, the jury delivered a unanimous verdict, guilty on multiple counts, including fraud, coercion, sexual exploitation, and unlawful surveillance. Pastor Omotoso received a lengthy prison sentence, effectively ending his decades-long cycle of manipulation. The aftermath in Virginia Beach was devastating. The House of Eternal Grace Fellowship dissolved within months. Families split apart over differing beliefs about Omotoso's guilt. Some congregants left religion entirely, traumatized by their betrayal. Emma Rodriguez entered therapy and eventually relocated to distance herself from painful memories. Sarah Nguyen, whose courage initiated the investigation, became an advocate for victims of spiritual abuse. Yet the community's lingering question remains etched in every conversation that followed the trial. How could a man who preached salvation orchestrate such suffering beneath the sanctuary lights? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Gérald Fontaine was, for many years, a respected spiritual figure in the city of North. He founded a small evangelical ministry that met in a renovated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was simple: white walls, plastic chairs, cheap speakers, and a humble wooden pulpit. Yet, despite its modest appearance, Fontaine managed to build a loyal congregation, mostly working-class families, recent immigrants, and lonely individuals searching for direction or belonging. Fontaine presented himself as a healer, a counselor, and a man blessed with divine insight. His sermons were emotional, dramatic, and infused with stories of miracles that supposedly occurred because of his prayer. Though critics called him theatrical, his followers found comfort in the intensity of his personality. They believed he saw them, heard them, and cared for them in ways others never had. But behind Fontaine's charisma lay a man who had long dreamed not of spiritual service, but of personal dominance. His ministry was never about salvation. It was about control. And control, in his mind, was achieved through fear, dependency, and secrecy. He targeted people going through life crises, a divorce, a job loss, a death in the family. When a grieving mother walked into the church, Fontaine was at her side within minutes. When a depressed man sought prayer, Fontaine insisted on private spiritual counseling sessions. These sessions often took place at night, behind locked doors, without witnesses. At first, nothing appeared overtly sinister. Fontaine was simply attentive, perhaps, but still within the boundaries of pastoral care. But as time passed, patterns emerged. Several women became unusually withdrawn. A few stopped speaking to their families. Some began giving large donations they could not afford. Fontaine groomed them through guilt and religious pressure, convincing them that sacrifice was the only way to demonstrate faith. What no one yet knew was that the situation was about to escalate into one of the most disturbing pastoral scandals in French evangelical history. In 2016, a young woman named Lee, then 23, began attending Fontaine's services. She had recently moved from Bordeaux after a difficult breakup and was desperate for community. Fontaine quickly noticed her vulnerability. He approached her after the service, offering prayer and guidance. Over the next few months, he repeatedly invited her to private sessions he described as deliverance rituals. Lee later testified that these sessions became controlling and psychologically abusive. Fontaine told her that spirits were attacking her mind, that her family was cursed, and that only he could protect her. She believed him, she trusted him, and because he was a pastor, she never questioned the increasingly strange rituals he performed, rituals that pushed deep into personal boundaries and blurred the line between spiritual authority and manipulation. Meanwhile, Fontaine's influence grew. He began preaching about demonic plots, claiming that the government, media, and even medical professionals were agents of darkness, trying to destroy the true believers. His sermons frightened people, but fear bound them to him. Some quit their jobs, others cut ties with relatives. Fontaine had successfully created a bubble of dependency. The first crack in his kingdom of control came from an unexpected source, a volunteer accountant who managed the church's donations. She noticed inconsistencies in the financial records, large pastoral expenses, unexplained withdrawals, and transfers to accounts not listed in the church registry. She confronted Fontaine. He dismissed her concerns with a calm smile and accused her of lacking faith, but she didn't let it go. Quietly, she contacted the authorities. French investigators, working with local police in Nantes, initiated a discreet financial review. They discovered that Fontaine had redirected tens of thousands of euros from congregational donations into a private account. This alone was serious, but the investigation didn't stop there. During interviews, police spoke to several former members who described intense psychological pressure, coercion, and ritualistic sessions that left them shaken and confused. A pattern of manipulation began to emerge, one that pointed toward far more than financial misconduct. The case took a darker turn when Lee, encouraged by a friend who suspected something was wrong, finally contacted law enforcement. She provided detailed accounts of Fontaine's private sessions, including the threats he used to keep her silent. She described nights where he insisted she was possessed and needed him alone. She broke down as she recounted how he convinced her that disobedience meant eternal torment. Her testimony matched similar stories from two other women who had previously been too afraid to speak. Armed with financial documents, witness testimonies, and indications of psychological and sexual exploitation, police moved quickly. Fontaine was arrested in early 2017 at the church office. During the search, authorities uncovered journals where he documented rituals, names of women he targeted, donations he expected them to make, and even notes on their emotional vulnerabilities. There was also a drawer containing envelopes of cash, labeled with initials matching some of the victims. News spread across France within hours. Major outlets like La Parisienne reported on the arrest. describing the church as a sect-like environment built through fear and manipulation. Families of congregants rushed to check on loved ones still involved. Some were relieved. Others were confronted with loved ones who insisted Fontaine was innocent, a holy man targeted by a corrupt system. The trial began in 2018 at the court in Red. It quickly became a national spectacle. Survivors testified through tears about the psychological torment, the isolation, and the rituals that Fontaine forced upon them. Financial experts described how he drained church funds while living a secret life funded by donations. Prosecutors painted the picture of a man who used religion as a weapon and saw his followers not as souls, but as resources. Fontaine's defense argued that the rituals were consensual, that donations were voluntary, and that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journals, bank transfers, witness testimonies, and emotional impact statements left little room for doubt. In the end, the court convicted him of fraud, psychological abuse, sexual coercion, and misuse of spiritual authority. He was sentenced to several years in prison and permanently barred from pastoral work. The verdict was met with relief by survivors and the broader community. But for many, the emotional wounds remained. After the case, French authorities tightened oversight on small independent ministries. Counseling guidelines were revised. Churches became more cautious about unchecked pastoral authority. Still, the damage lingered, especially for those who had given years of their lives to Fontaine's manipulation. Lee eventually rebuilt her life, though she described the process as slow and painful. Other survivors found support networks that helped them reclaim their sense of identity. The church itself dissolved shortly after the trial, its building eventually sold and repurposed. Fontaine remains in prison today, serving his sentence. He has shown little remorse, continuing to claim he was misunderstood. But the stories of those he harmed tell a very different narrative, one of a man who saw faith as a mask, authority as a weapon, and vulnerability as an opportunity. The haunting question that remains is this: how many people like him walk among positions of trust, hiding behind scripture, charisma, and good intentions, waiting for their moment to exploit the faith placed in them? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Daniel Hawthorne built his reputation in the quiet suburban edges of Lexington, where the streets were lined with trimmed lawns, brick homes, and families who had long believed in the stability of their community. His church, the modestly sized but rapidly growing New Promise Chapel, became a spiritual anchor for many who felt lost, grieving, or in search of direction. Hawthorne was warm, magnetic, and impossibly convincing. He remembered everyone's names. He asked about their marriages, their illnesses, their children's birthdays. Every handshake felt heartfelt, every hug sincere. Congregants spoke about him the way people discuss heroes. He listens, they said. He really cares. For many, he became the perfect pastor, someone who could turn a simple Bible verse into a moment of personal revelation. But behind his carefully crafted persona was a man driven not by faith, but by a hunger for control, admiration, and the thrill of manipulation. The church was not his calling. It was his stage. Before arriving in Lexington, Hawthorne had lived an itinerant life, moving between small ministries in Cincinnati, Knoxville, and a few scattered rural towns. Each time he left, there were rumors, questions about finances, whispers of inappropriate behavior but nothing was ever proven, and so he moved on, always a new start waiting somewhere else. In Lexington, however, he found the perfect environment, one where he could build a loyal base quickly. Within 3 years, New Promise Chapel expanded from 40 regular attendees to nearly 300. Donations increased, families volunteered, the church bought new equipment, remodeled the sanctuary, and launched community programs that seemed both generous and ambitious. No one suspected the darkness growing behind the scenes. The first signs of trouble came from a woman named Allison Briggs, a 34-year-old mother of 2 who joined the church after losing her husband in a car accident. Grief-stricken and vulnerable, she found comfort in Hawthorne's attention. He visited her home, prayed with her, and assured her that God had a purpose even in tragedy. Over time, these visits became more frequent, weekly, then daily. He told her she was chosen, that God had a special plan for her healing, and that only He could guide her through it. Allison believed him. She trusted him in the way one trusts a doctor or therapist, someone trained and ordained to help. But Hawthorne crossed boundaries that no pastor should cross. He isolated her from friends, suggested that her family interfered with God's work, and encouraged her to confess private details of her life that he later used to manipulate her. She grew increasingly dependent on him. When she tried to step back, he warned her that doing so would invite spiritual torment. Allison didn't yet realize she was being groomed. Meanwhile, other congregants noticed financial oddities. Church funds were being redirected for unnamed pastoral projects. New equipment appeared that didn't match the budget, and Hawthorne occasionally arrived at services in different rental cars, claiming his own vehicle was in repair. 2 board members confronted him. He responded with calm disappointment, telling them they were allowing Satan to sow division. They apologized. The conversation ended. The suspicion remained. The turning point came in 2019, when a 17-year-old girl named Sarah, a quiet teenager known for her love of music and unwavering faith, confided in a school counselor that Pastor Hawthorne made her uncomfortable. She described late-night messages, private prayer sessions he insisted on, and conversations that veered into topics no pastor should discuss with a minor. The counselor, bound by law, reported the concern to Child Protective Services. Investigators met with Sarah, her parents, and eventually with Hawthorne himself. He denied everything, labeling the allegations as misunderstandings fueled by spiritual immaturity. Many congregants believed him immediately after all. Who would suspect the man who cried during sermons and spent holidays feeding the homeless? But the investigation did not end. Authorities contacted to previous churches where Hawthorne had worked. What they found was unsettling. There were old complaints never formally filed of inappropriate behavior with women and teenagers, financial discrepancies, reports of emotional manipulation. Each church had quietly encouraged him to move on rather than pursue public scandal. This time, there would be no quiet exit. Parallel to the child safety investigation, a financial audit began on New Promise Chapel's accounts. The findings were damning. Hawthorne had siphoned nearly $140,000 over 3 years from church tithes into a personal account he registered under a consulting business name. The church board, horrified, voted to remove him from all financial responsibilities pending further inquiry. But Hawthorne acted first. He delivered a fiery sermon accusing unnamed members of betrayal, claiming he was being persecuted just as biblical prophets had been. He hinted that the church was under spiritual attack. Many congregants rallied behind him. Others quietly left, sensing something was deeply wrong. The situation escalated months later when Allison Briggs, the grieving widow, ended up in the emergency room after collapsing at home. She admitted to hospital staff that she had been pressured by Hawthorne to fast for long periods, to the point of physical weakness. She also revealed psychological manipulation that left doctors deeply concerned. Her statement prompted a full criminal inquiry, combining allegations of abuse of authority, financial fraud, coercion, and misconduct involving minors. Police obtained a warrant to search Hawthorne's home. What they found shattered any remaining illusions. Inside a locked office cabinet were dozens of private journals detailing his sessions, with vulnerable congregants' notes on their weaknesses, fears, traumas, and how to maintain control over them. He wrote about spiritual tests he imposed, several of which involved young women and teenagers. There were also dozens of USB drives containing private recordings of counseling sessions, some featuring underage girls. Even investigators described the material as one of the most disturbing breaches of trust they had seen from a religious leader. Hawthorne was arrested in 2020, charged with financial fraud, coercion, misconduct with minors, and unlawful surveillance. The news spread quickly across Lex 18 News and regional outlets. During the trial in Fayette County Courthouse, survivors testified with trembling voices. Sarah, the teenager, recounted the emotional pressure he placed on her. Allison described the psychological hold he maintained over her grief-stricken mind. Former board members spoke about financial deception. Prosecutors presented journal entries that made the courtroom fall silent. Hawthorne's defense attempted to argue that the relationships were consensual, that the financial transfers were for church growth, and that recordings were part of pastoral documentation. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the judge had little patience for the misuse of spiritual authority. He was convicted on multiple counts, including exploitation of minors, fraud, and coercive control. He received a lengthy prison sentence, effectively ending his pastoral career. New Promise Chapel nearly collapsed in the aftermath. Attendance plummeted. Families fractured over differing beliefs about Hawthorne's guilt. Volunteers quit. Donations dried up. The church eventually reorganized under new leadership, implementing strict policies on counseling, finances, and transparency. As for the survivors, healing has been long and deeply personal. Sarah's family moved to another state to escape the memories. Allison slowly rebuilt her sense of identity, though she later described feeling spiritually homeless for years after the ordeal. Several other victims formed a support group, helping one another navigate the emotional fallout of betrayal disguised as love. Hawthorne sits in a federal correctional facility today, still claiming he was targeted by jealous church members and misunderstood by the courts. But the journal's testimonies and financial records paint a much clearer picture. A man who weaponized scripture, exploited trust, and preyed upon the wounded to satisfy his own hunger for power. The community's lingering question echoes long after the trial ended. How can a man who preached about light commit his darkest acts in God's name? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Pastor Olaf Jørgensen was once considered the quiet backbone of his small coastal town in western Denmark. Born and raised near Ringkøbing, he grew up in a community where honesty was valued. Neighbors trusted one another, and religion served as a gentle guide rather than a hammer. Jørgensen's path into ministry seemed natural. He was soft-spoken, helpful, and possessed the steady presence that elderly parishioners loved. For years, he preached in the little whitewashed chapel at the edge of town, telling families to choose compassion, to value truth, and to shield their souls from greed. No one imagined that greed was the exact thing silently consuming him. For nearly 2 decades, Jørgensen had built a persona rooted in humility. He wore simple clothes, drove an aging car, and insisted that the church should donate more to the poor. People listened because he seemed genuine. They trusted him with personal problems, confessions, and even their financial worries. That trust gave him something dangerous: access. The elderly members of the congregation often asked him for help handling official letters, pensions, and bank paperwork. At first, he did only what was requested, but at some point, no one knows exactly when, help turned into manipulation. The earliest signs were barely noticeable. A widow complained that her monthly pension seemed lower than expected. An older man mentioned that his bank had contacted him regarding a new joint account he never remembered opening. But these concerns were brushed aside by others who insisted it must have been bureaucratic errors. After all, this was Denmark. Official mistakes happened, but pastors didn't steal. That idea was unthinkable. But crime thrives not where trust is absent, rather where trust is absolute. In 2019, a social worker in the municipality of HF Sand noticed a strange pattern involving several elderly residents. Their finances were deteriorating rapidly, but they had no major expenses. Some could no longer afford medication. Others couldn't explain why their savings seemed to evaporate. The social worker initially suspected family exploitation, an unfortunately common issue. But when she reviewed cases more closely, she found an unexpected link. Every one of these elders was a member of Pastor Jørgensen's congregation. She reported her concerns to local authorities, who opened a quiet preliminary inquiry. They approached banks, pension offices, and digital ID records. At first, nothing obvious surfaced. The accounts seemed legitimate, the signatures valid, and the changes correctly filed via Denmark's secure electronic system. But persistence began to peel back the layers. A bank employee in Jyske Bank flagged something subtle. All the elderly victims had added the same additional user to their online accounts. Someone with the same recovery phone number. Someone with the same mailing address. That someone was Pastor Olaf Jørgensen. Even then, investigators hesitated. The evidence was suspicious, yes, but not damning. Perhaps the pastor merely assisted them with online banking. Perhaps they had authorized him to handle their affairs. But the more they investigated, the more difficult it became to believe in innocence. Police quietly obtained warrants to examine digital logs. They found that money transfers from victims' accounts often occurred late at night, sometimes minutes apart, as though someone sat in front of a laptop and emptied one account after another. When questioned, several elderly parishioners said they never used online banking at night. Some didn't even own computers. Others had no idea their accounts were accessible online at all. The investigators then discovered something chilling: multiple wills stored digitally, each naming Pastor Jørgensen as primary beneficiary. These wills were filed through Denmark's secure system, but experts determined that digital signatures were inconsistent with the victim's normal signing patterns. Several of the supposed signers claimed they had never created or even discussed a will. The evidence now pointed toward deliberate financial predation. The only question was how far it went. By late 2020, police placed Pastor Jurgensen under discreet surveillance. What they saw was unsettling. He visited vulnerable parishioners frequently, often alone, often under the guise of spiritual guidance. He brought paperwork with him. One woman later reported that he asked to help reorganize her pensions so she could leave a legacy. She refused. Within a week, her online banking showed a failed attempt to add a new user, an attempt traced to an IP address at the church's office. That was when police decided to move swiftly. One cold December morning, officers entered the chapel office with a warrant. They confiscated computers, documents, USB drives, handwritten notes, and financial ledgers. During interrogation, Jurgensen maintained calmness, even smiling gently as he claimed it was all a misunderstanding. He insisted he simply helped his congregation with confusing financial systems. But forensic experts soon dismantled that narrative. On the seized computer, investigators found a meticulously organized spreadsheet listing dozens of elderly parishioners, their income levels, banking access codes, digital signatures, and projected life expectancy. The spreadsheet had a disturbing title: Long-Term Sustainability Planning. Police also found correspondence drafts written as if from the victim's letters withdrawing complaints, letters authorizing account access, letters praising the pastor's financial wisdom. These drafts were stored but never sent, suggesting they were templates for future manipulation. The case exploded in national media when charges were formally announced. Danish outlets, including Dr. Nyheder, published detailed reports describing what was now being called one of the most calculated elder exploitation schemes in modern Danish history. Journalists uncovered even more victims, some who had died. Their estate funds quietly rerouted to church maintenance accounts, controlled solely by families were horrified. Many had trusted him with funerals, marriages, and baptisms. They had welcomed him into their homes. Some blamed themselves for never questioning why their parents' finances seemed off. Others were simply in disbelief. The trial began in 2021 at the district court near Holstebro and lasted several weeks. Prosecutors presented digital evidence, bank records, testimonies from victims, and forensic analysis. Jurgensen continued to portray himself as a misunderstood servant of faith, insisting he never stole intentionally. But when asked to explain the spreadsheet, the forged wills, or the late-night transfers, he faltered. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. Even those who once defended him began to withdraw. One elderly victim, a former nurse, gave emotional testimony describing how she trusted him completely until she realized her life savings had been siphoned away. Another man testified that Jurgensen encouraged him to sign forms to streamline banking, only to discover later that he had unknowingly granted the pastor full financial authority. In the end, the court convicted Jurgensen of large-scale fraud, document forgery, identity misuse, and systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. He was sentenced to several years in prison and ordered to repay millions of kroner money he had already spent. After sentencing, the community experienced a deep identity crisis. The small coastal towns of western Denmark were places where trust flowed naturally. That trust had been weaponized. Church attendance dropped sharply. Parish councils across the region implemented new financial safeguards. Some congregants still felt guilty, believing they should have noticed the signs sooner. Others refused to speak of him again, determined to erase his shadow from their memories. As of his most recent public record, Jurgensen remains incarcerated. Some victims received partial restitution through state compensation programs. Others never recovered financially or emotionally. The effects of his crimes stretched far beyond bank accounts. They shattered a pillar of community belief. This story leaves behind a haunting question. How does a person entrusted with souls choose instead to prey on them? And how many others, hidden behind scripture and trust, have learned that the easiest victims are those who see you as a guiding light, rather than a threat in the dark? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. The story of Gérald Brewster begins in the quiet outskirts of Dayton, Ohio, where a modest red brick church sat on a hill overlooking a sleepy neighborhood. For years, it was a place of calm sermons, Sunday potlucks, and small-town community warmth. but behind its polished wooden pulpit stood a man whose carefully curated image hid the truth of what he was becoming. Gérald wasn't born into religion. His early life was chaotic and unstable home, a father who drifted between jobs, and a mother whose presence was mostly defined by long silences and cigarette smoke. What he did learn early was performance. He learned how to charm, how to adjust his personality to whoever stood in front of him, how to make adults smile even as he quietly stole the coins from their coffee tables. By the time he reached high school, he realized something powerful. People wanted to believe in him. All he had to do was give them the version of himself they needed. His entry into ministry wasn't driven by faith, it was driven by opportunity. He began as an energetic young volunteer at a Cincinnati church and quickly figured out how easily religious trust could be converted into influence. By his mid-30s, he had crafted himself into a charismatic preacher with a polished voice, a calm smile, and a remarkable talent for making troubled people feel safe. When he was offered pastoral leadership of a small Ohio congregation, he accepted without hesitation, and soon after, he became known throughout the community as Pastor Jerry, a man who seemed too kind, too helpful, too perfect. But those who grew close to him sensed something else, a stiffness behind the smile, a controlling edge to his kindness, a strange discomfort in the way he inserted himself into people's personal struggles. His congregation brushed it aside. They wanted to believe in him. They needed someone to trust, and he played that role flawlessly. The shift from spiritual leader to manipulator began quietly. Gérald developed private counseling sessions, where he encouraged vulnerable members, especially young adults and struggling women, to confide in him deeply. He framed it as spiritual healing. What it really became was a gateway to exploitation. One of the first to sense this was a young woman named Melissa Harding, who sought pastoral help after losing her job. Gérald offered sessions multiple times a week, always insisting they remain private. At first he talked about hope, about perseverance, about God's plan, but soon his conversations twisted. He began insisting she needed to submit spiritually to him. He framed his control as divine authority. When Melissa grew uncomfortable and tried to pull away, he threatened her with what he called the consequences of rebellion. He told her God would turn against her if she rejected the person God had sent to guide her. She left a session trembling, unsure what to believe. She wasn't the only one. Others began to notice Gérald's increasingly inappropriate boundaries: late night texts framed as urgent pastoral matters, uninvited visits to homes, questions that dug far too deeply into private lives, especially those of women who were emotionally vulnerable or financially dependent. Yet none of them felt confident enough to speak publicly against the man the community adored. Gérald grew bold. His manipulation became a system. He used fear wrapped in scripture, warmth wrapped in control, and kindness shaped into personal leverage. Those who didn't fall under his influence he pushed away, quietly convincing church elders that certain members were spiritually corrosive. And then came the crime that finally broke the silence. One of the teenagers in the youth group, a girl named Alyssa Moore, began withdrawing from activities. Her mother noticed that she flinched when Gérald approached. She refused to attend Wednesday Bible studies but wouldn't explain why. It took months before Alyssa finally confided what had happened. During a private mentorship meeting, Gérald had cornered her, touched her without consent, and warned her that speaking out would destroy the church. Her mother immediately went to the police. The investigation uncovered more than anyone expected. Detectives found text messages Gérald had deleted but were retrieved from backups. They interviewed former congregants who had left without explanation. Patterns emerged. Stories overlapped. The same manipulations, the same threats, the same justifications hidden behind sermons. The church board was devastated. The congregation fractured almost overnight. Some members refused to believe the accusations, clinging to the image of the man who had baptized their children. Others felt sick realizing how long they had ignored their instincts. Gérald denied everything. He claimed he was the victim of a coordinated attack, that spiritual darkness was targeting him because of his holy work. But the evidence continued to pile up. Messages, testimonies, inconsistencies in his counseling logs, and recorded statements converged into a picture too clear to deny. The trial began amid local media attention. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Former church members stared at the man they once trusted as he entered the building in a gray suit that now seemed too sharp, too calculated. Prosecutors argued that Gérald had systematically used his role to exploit vulnerable congregants. They detailed his manipulation techniques, played audio clips, and read aloud transcripts. The courtroom fell silent as Alyssa testified, her voice trembling but resolute. Gérald's defense attempted to paint each victim as confused, vindictive, or misinterpreting spiritual guidance. The jury didn't buy it. After weeks of testimony, they returned with a verdict: guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, coercion, and abuse of authority. When the judge delivered the sentence, decades in state prison, Gérald finally broke. He shouted scriptures in the courtroom, claiming himself a martyr. The outburst only underscored how deeply delusional his self-image had become. Prison stripped him of the identity he had built. His charisma meant nothing behind bars. His manipulation had fewer places to hide. The man who once stood behind a pulpit, preaching humility and obedience, now sat alone in a concrete cell, his voice reduced to echoes swallowed by the walls. The aftermath rippled through Dayton for years. The church shut down. Families divided over whether they had been blind or betrayed. Survivors spent years rebuilding trust in themselves, in others, and in the idea of spiritual safety. Melissa moved out of state. Alyssa received therapy and eventually became an advocate for victims of religious authority abuse. Her courage became the beginning of healing for many. The city remembered Gérald Brewster not as a man of God, but as someone who weaponized faith to mask his obsessions. Every sermon he had preached now felt tainted. Every blessing he had given now felt hollow. The haunting question that lingers on the community still wrestles with this painfully simple: how many warnings did they ignore because the man delivering them held a Bible? And how many more like him are still standing behind pulpits, waiting for trust to become an open door? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the late 1960s, when spiritual movements were sweeping across the United States, a man named Tony Alamo emerged as a charismatic voice promising salvation, healing, and divine purpose. 2000s, he was a preacher, a prophet, and a miracle worker. But to those who lived behind the locked gates of his compounds, he would become synonymous with fear, exploitation, and cruelty that hid beneath the polished veneer of religious righteousness. Tony Alamo was born as Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri. His childhood was unremarkable except for one trait that defined him early. He understood the power of attention. He learned how to control a room, how to adjust his tone to command emotion, and how to present himself as someone who carried rare knowledge. By adulthood, he was drifting between industries: entertainment, sales, promotions, but nothing stuck until he found the one tool he could shape into absolute authority: religion. His rise began when he met Susan Alamo, a woman who shared his flair for persuasion. The two reinvented themselves, adopting new names, new identities, and a new mission. They founded the Tony Alamo Christian Foundation, a ministry based first in California, before expanding to lands in Arkansas and other states. Their pitch was simple: spiritual purity, communal living, and separation from the corrupting influence of the outside world. For many lost souls, runaways, abandoned teens, addicts, people searching for meaning, the foundation felt like a safe haven. At least at first. The compound in Dyer, Arkansas, became the center of his religious empire. It operated like a closed world. Members worked without pay, lived in crowded communal housing, and followed strict rules enforced with disturbing intensity. Their labor helped build Alamo's wealth: construction, clothing manufacturing, distribution of religious literature, yet none of the profit ever reached the workers themselves. Alamo framed this exploitation as service to God. His sermons, broadcast on television and radio, made him a national religious figure. He preached about judgment, purity, and the evils of governmental interference. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, thousands followed him. Yet behind the camera lights and polished rhetoric, Alamo built a world where he controlled everything: what members ate, where they worked, who they married, and even when they were allowed to speak. When Susan died in 1982, something inside him fractured. Grief wasn't the word anger was. Reports from former followers described a shift in his behavior: more paranoid, more authoritarian, more obsessed with maintaining total dominance. He demanded that Susan's body be preserved, believing she would resurrect. For months, he refused to bury her, and he forced church members to view her body as a symbol of his spiritual connection. Many later described that period as the moment fear overtook faith. Over the next years, Alamo's rule transformed into absolute authoritarianism. Anyone who questioned him was publicly humiliated, isolated, or beaten. Families were divided. Children were taken from parents and placed into labor roles or strict spiritual discipline programs. His voice became law, and he insisted that everything he commanded came directly from God. Then came the darkest truth, one that would eventually bring his empire down. Alamo began selecting young girls from within the compound, declaring that God had given him spiritual permission to take them as wives. He used scripture to justify the abuse, telling families that refusing him would bring divine punishment. Terrified, many parents complied. Others protested and were beaten or expelled, leaving their children behind if they were unable to take them. The stories that emerged later were horrific: manipulation, coercion, forced marriages, and abuses that lasted years. Several girls described nights when Alamo would call them to his private quarters, insisting they were chosen by God. The trauma of those experiences left scars that stretched far beyond the years they spent inside his compound. For a long time, no one outside the ministry believed the rumors. Alamo was too well connected, too visible, too practiced in deflecting accusations. He painted former members as liars, government agents, or tools of Satan. His supporters defended him fiercely. Meanwhile, the compound continued to operate like a fortress, hiding what was happening within. But eventually, survivors began speaking publicly. Parents who had escaped fought to regain custody of their children. Advocacy groups documented stories from former members, and law enforcement, federal and state, began paying attention. The turning point came when several victims agreed to testify against him. Their accounts revealed a pattern of abuse stretching across states and decades. Armed with new evidence, authorities raided the compound. Children were removed and placed into protective custody. Adults, long conditioned to obey Alamo, found themselves staring at the collapse of the world they had known. Investigators uncovered financial fraud, labor violations, child abuse, and forced marriages. Alamo, who claimed every accusation was a spiritual attack, could no longer hide behind his pulpit. In 2008, he was arrested in Flagstaff, Arizona, after months on the run. When brought into custody, he maintained he was the victim, insisting that the government was persecuting him for preaching the true gospel. The trial that followed shocked the nation. Prosecutors presented testimony from multiple girls who had been abused. They described how Alamo manipulated scripture to justify his actions, how he controlled their families, how he terrorized them into silence. Jurors listened to details that were difficult to hear: young ages, threats of divine retribution, nights of fear, and years of psychological trauma. The defense attempted to dismiss the girls' testimonies as fabrications, but the consistency among accounts, combined with physical evidence and historical records, dismantled every argument. The picture was clear. Tony Alamo had built his ministry as a shield, one that hid his crimes behind the illusion of religious authority. The verdict was swift: guilty on all counts related to transporting minors for criminal purposes. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, a symbolic number representing the severity and duration of the crimes. As the sentence was read, Alamo stared at the judge, expression unflinching, still insisting he was a martyr. Inside prison, Alamo remained defiant. He continued writing letters to followers, declaring that God would deliver him. He never admitted wrongdoing, never apologized, never acknowledged the lives he had destroyed. He died in 2017 at the age of 82, still claiming innocence. The aftermath of his downfall left a long shadow across Arkansas and beyond. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. Some suffered lifelong trauma. Others found strength in speaking about what had happened. Many families reunited after years of separation, trying to mend relationships broken by Alamo's control. Communities near the compound wrestled with guilt: how such horror could have existed so close, how they missed the signs, how his smiling televangelist face had fooled so many for so long. The remnants of the ministry slowly dissolved, but the emotional wreckage endured. The most haunting part of Tony Alamo's story isn't only the crimes he committed, it's how he used the language of faith to justify them, how he wrapped cruelty in scripture, how he turned devotion into obedience, how he built a kingdom where questioning him felt like questioning God. And it leaves a question that echoes far beyond his life. How many people followed him because they believed in God, and how many stayed because they were too afraid to believe he wasn't speaking for him? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the affluent suburbs of Hartford, Connecticut, Pastor Mark DuPont arrived in 2002 with the kind of charm that could warm even the coldest of congregations. DuPont, a man in his early 40s, had studied theology at a prestigious seminary on the East Coast and presented himself as a preacher committed to family values, spiritual growth, and community outreach. His sermons were meticulous, often weaving biblical passages with personal anecdotes that left congregants both inspired and emotionally invested. Many described him as a pastor who seemed to embody sincerity, a man who could transform doubt into unwavering faith, with nothing more than a calm voice and a reassuring hand on the shoulder. DuPont's church, Grace Covenant Fellowship, started modestly in a converted community center. Within 2 years, he had drawn hundreds of families, many relocating to the neighborhood simply to attend his services. Parents trusted him with their children in Sunday school. Teens sought him out for guidance through life's challenges. Adults relied on his counsel for financial decisions, marriages, and personal crises. His charisma was magnetic, his presence seemingly wholesome, but beneath the veneer of devoutness lay a calculated predatory mind. DuPont began identifying members who were vulnerable, particularly young women struggling with personal challenges, isolation, or trauma. He created what he called mentorship programs for teenagers and young adults, presented as opportunities for spiritual development and moral guidance. In reality, these programs were grooming mechanisms designed to cultivate dependence, manipulate trust, and facilitate control over his victims. The first publicized case emerged in 2006 when Emily Larson, a 19-year-old college student, came forward. Emily had been a regular attendee of DuPont's youth mentoring sessions. Initially, she described him as supportive, insightful, and deeply invested in her spiritual well-being. However, over several months, DuPont's behavior became intrusive. He demanded private sessions outside the church, questioned her personal life excessively, and increasingly framed obedience to him as obedience to God. Emily's family began noticing changes: anxiety, withdrawal from social life, and a growing reluctance to interact with peers or even relatives. DuPont's tactics were meticulous. He alternated between praise and intimidation, ensuring his mentees felt both chosen and beholden. He frequently emphasized that their spiritual growth depended entirely on his guidance, portraying dissent as not just rebellious but sinful. Many of his victims later testified that they genuinely believed they were serving God by following his instructions, no matter how uncomfortable or inappropriate the requests became. Simultaneously, DuPont extended his influence into financial control. He encouraged families to make large donations to community outreach programs and manipulated young adults into surrendering personal funds under the guise of spiritual commitment. Investigators later discovered that he had redirected thousands of dollars into personal accounts, funding luxury purchases and trips that were concealed from the congregation. The breaking point came when Emily finally confided to her roommate about DuPont's coercive and manipulative behavior. Her roommate, concerned for her safety, contacted authorities. This prompted a discreet investigation by the Hartford Police Department. Law enforcement began collecting testimonies from former mentees, scrutinizing church finances, and tracing communications between DuPont and his victims. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Multiple young women described remarkably similar experiences: initial mentoring, private meetings, psychological manipulation, and eventual coercion into sexual acts, framed as spiritual obedience. Evidence also showed that DuPont meticulously maintained records of these interactions in personal journals, outlining vulnerabilities, fears, and pressures he had applied to each individual. Financial records corroborated his exploitation, revealing a mixture of deceptive fundraising and misappropriation of donations. By 2008, law enforcement had sufficient evidence to pursue formal charges. DuPont was arrested on multiple counts, including sexual exploitation, fraud, and abuse of authority. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Congregants who had believed DuPont to be a beacon of moral integrity were forced to confront the reality of manipulation, hiding behind sermons and charity events. Families expressed betrayal and disbelief, some defending him to the very end, while others vowed to assist authorities in ensuring justice was served. The trial at the Hartford Superior Court was grueling. Survivors testified with remarkable courage, recounting years of coercion, psychological abuse, and spiritual manipulation. Emily Larson described the night she spent fearing she had sinned, simply for questioning his instructions. Other victims detailed similar experiences: private counseling sessions that led to exploitation, coercive financial demands, and emotional control designed to isolate them from support networks. The prosecution presented not only victim testimony, but also corroborating evidence, financial records, journals, emails, and patterns of behavior consistent across multiple victims. The defense argued that interactions were consensual and that financial contributions were voluntary acts of faith. However, the overwhelming consistency of the testimonies, combined with documentary evidence, left little room for doubt. DuPont was convicted on all counts. He received a lengthy sentence, including years of imprisonment and a permanent ban from pastoral work. The court emphasized the calculated nature of his actions and the betrayal of trust inherent in his position as a spiritual leader. The aftermath reverberated across Hartford. Grace Covenant Fellowship experienced a dramatic decline in attendance and donations, ultimately disbanding after attempts to reorganize failed. Survivors began long and difficult journeys toward healing, with counseling and support groups aiding their recovery. Families worked to rebuild trust and understand how deeply manipulation had penetrated what they believed to be a safe spiritual community. DuPont's case prompted broader discussions on oversight, accountability, and safeguards within religious institutions. Authorities encouraged local churches to implement transparent governance, enforce strict reporting mechanisms, and educate congregants about boundaries and the potential for exploitation, even in communities that appear morally upright. Today, the story of Mark DuPont serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of survivors. It underscores the delicate balance between faith and authority, and the vulnerability that can exist when trust is weaponized under the guise of spirituality. The haunting question lingers for the community: how many individuals in positions of sacred trust are hiding darkness behind a familiar and comforting smile? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. In the rolling hills of Nashville, Tennessee, a city known for music, culture, and Southern charm, Pastor Robert Bob Williams emerged in the late 1990s as a figure of community respect. He led Faith and Light Church, a modest congregation that quickly gained a reputation for warm services, active youth programs, and extensive community outreach. On the surface, Williams was the model pastor, approachable, articulate, and attentive to the needs of his congregants. He visited the sick, counseled troubled teens, and organized charitable drives, earning trust from families who believed they had found a spiritual anchor in him. Williams' rise was fueled by his charisma. He understood how to inspire devotion and loyalty, drawing people into a carefully constructed orbit of dependence. Parents felt confident leaving their children in his care, believing that he was both morally upright and spiritually enlightened. Teens and young adults viewed him as a mentor and role model, someone who could guide them through the challenges of adolescence and young adulthood. Yet beneath the polished exterior, a darker pattern began to unfold, one that would shake the community to its core. His manipulation began subtly. Williams initiated private counseling sessions with young women in the congregation, presenting them as opportunities for personal growth and spiritual guidance. He offered attention, praise, and encouragement, creating a sense of special selection for those chosen. As these sessions continued, boundaries blurred. Conversations shifted into areas that were increasingly personal and psychologically invasive. He leveraged his pastoral authority to establish control, often framing resistance as spiritual failure or sinfulness. The first victim to come forward publicly was a young woman named Rachel Harris, then 19. Rachel had grown up attending Faith and Light Church, participating in choir, youth group activities, and community service. She described initially feeling nurtured by Williams, trusting him with personal concerns that ranged from academic struggles to family conflict. Over time, however, his guidance turned coercive. He pressured her into compliance with directives that made her uncomfortable and framed compliance as essential to her spiritual growth. Rachel began isolating from friends and family, fearing judgment and believing that questioning the pastor would result in divine punishment. Financial exploitation was also evident. Williams encouraged families to donate generously to mission projects, often promising that contributions would be used for outreach or charitable purposes. Investigators later revealed that substantial amounts were redirected into personal accounts, funding lifestyle expenses and investments that were never disclosed to the congregation. His manipulation intertwined spiritual control with material benefit, creating a cycle in which questioning him became both a moral and financial risk. The tipping point came when Rachel confided in a school counselor after a particularly distressing session. The counselor, recognizing the potential for abuse, contacted the Nashville Police Department. Authorities discreetly initiated an investigation, interviewing other young women involved in pastoral counseling programs. Soon, a pattern emerged, multiple victims describing remarkably similar forms of coercion, emotional manipulation, and abuse that exploited their trust in a religious authority figure. The investigation intensified. Detectives obtained emails, text messages, and church records that corroborated the victims' testimonies. They discovered private journals kept by Williams, detailing personal information about congregants, their vulnerabilities, and methods of persuasion he employed to maintain control over them. The material painted a clear picture, a calculated, manipulative figure, exploiting faith to satisfy his desires and consolidate authority. Williams was arrested in 2005 on multiple charges, including sexual exploitation, fraud, and abuse of trust. News of his arrest shocked the local community. Congregants struggled to reconcile the image of a trusted spiritual guide with that of a criminal predator. Families felt betrayed, some denying the evidence, while others sought to assist law enforcement and support the victims. The trial at Davidson County Criminal Court was intense. Victims provided courageous testimonies, recounting years of psychological coercion and emotional manipulation. Rachel Harris described the profound internal conflict she faced, believing for months that compliance was a religious obligation. Other witnesses detailed patterns of abuse across multiple victims, illustrating the systemic nature of Williams' exploitation. Prosecutors presented compelling evidence, financial records showing misappropriated donations, documented communications corroborating coercive behavior, and detailed journals illustrating deliberate manipulation strategies. The defense attempted to portray the victims as confused or misguided, but the overwhelming consistency of the accounts and the documentary proof left little room for doubt. Williams was convicted on all charges and received a lengthy prison sentence, including a prohibition on working in any religious capacity. The court highlighted the betrayal of trust inherent in his actions, noting the profound impact on victims and the broader community. In the aftermath, Faith and Light Church struggled to recover. Attendance declined sharply, and remaining members implemented new governance policies aimed at transparency and accountability. Survivors sought long-term therapy and support networks to rebuild lives disrupted by Williams' abuse. Families confronted difficult truths about the danger of unchecked authority within religious institutions and the vulnerability of those who place blind faith in charismatic leaders. Williams' case became a cautionary tale within Tennessee and beyond. It underscored the critical need for oversight in religious communities, the importance of safeguarding vulnerable members, and the necessity of fostering environments where questioning authority is possible without fear of spiritual reprisal. Survivors, through advocacy and public testimony, transformed personal trauma into awareness campaigns, ensuring that the mechanisms of manipulation and coercion became visible to the wider community. The haunting question left by Williams' crimes continues to resonate. How often does the guise of spiritual guidance mask predation? And how many more trusted figures may be hiding darkness behind the pulpit? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.